just like that, Ryan has joined us.
Hello.
Everyone knows
enough of the song.
It's funny, actually. You can see us all doing that in between the segments. Welcome, Ryan. Welcome to the show. Please tell our viewers who you are and what you do at AWS.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a principal product manager in the Serverless group. I'm focused on developer tools.
Awesome. Right. So we are going to be talking about Application Composer, which became generally available this week. And I think my colleague Chani on the news blog has got a post out about it, which you can go and check out later on. But to start with, I'm going to guess that most viewers are probably familiar with the term serverless now, right? It's, you're not managing infrastructure, you're just deploying code and having it run. But when developers are working on that kind of thing, what do they need to keep in mind? What's different?
Yeah, well, there's a lot different for sure. I see sort of two big halves to kind of break that problem down. There's a developer learning event-driven architectures. So how do you build sort of a distributed application on a public cloud? And then the other side of that is that if you're building on a public cloud, building on managed services, many of those managed services, you have infrastructure as code to define and have a durable artifact that you can have in your version control process to codify all the resources that you're using. And serverless especially emphasizes the I in infrastructure almost becomes a misnomer because it's not a pipeline, it's not a cluster, it's a queue, it's a database table, it's all these sort of micro resources that power your application that just happen to be expressed in an infrastructure as code format so that you can reliably and repeatably build up the application and the architecture it depends on.
Yeah, because back in the day, when I used to be hands-on, I would rack and stack and configure all the things, and we would think infrastructure is what we can actually touch and put in our hands, but it's way beyond that now. Now it's about architecture and the design patterns and making it scalable and repeatable and taking the human element and the mistakes that we make out of the picture as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's kind of it's maybe less about the code now, but more about how you're wiring things together. In a sense, the way I look at it, right? So, I mean, when you're doing that development for serverless, right, there's still resources you need to think about, right? Assets you need to work with, and so on. So, what kind of assets are out there that people traditionally use today? That before we move on to App Composer, what are they working with?
Yeah, so on the IC side of the equation, there's a whole bunch of frameworks you might be using. You could be using AWS CloudFormation. That's like one of the most basic building blocks you can leverage and express all kinds of things. There's AWS SAM, which is sort of a superset of that. Then you have, of course, the Cloud Development Kit, AWS CDK. And then there's a lot of third-party frameworks as well that allow you to express these things on AWS.
Yeah, I'm guessing that a lot of you are probably familiar with the templates, JSON or YAML templates and so on, but they may not be familiar with the CDK, the Cloud Development Kit. So for anyone watching, if you're new to the show, that's where you can actually define your infrastructure in code. So using the code that you use day to day, like C#, Java, JavaScript, Python, whatever it happens to be, you can just define your infrastructure in that without needing to jump into a separate templating language. So it feels like we're kind of on a journey, right? We've gone from templates in, say, JSON or YAML through CDK, and now we're arriving at the composer. So how does that simplify the experience?
Yeah, so and I look at both of those just as an aside. I spent a lot of time in data center operations for most of my career and worked at an infrastructure as code company that focused on sort of a declarative language. And there's very much a stylistic preference between a declarative language like a YAML document and an imperative sort of code language, like if you're using CDK, you can write in TypeScript, Python, etc. Both of those, you're taking complexity out of your head and putting it on text. And in each of those situations, the longer it gets, so, a typical, even sample sized application in YAML format would be like 500 lines. It gets hard to then in your head, read it back to you and understand like, okay, I've read all lines of this code and I understand in my head the mental model for the application. So the approach with Composer that you'll see in a moment is trying to take that same sort of durable artifact, but transform it into a visualization that you can interact with. So you can start kind of matching your mental model with the actual durable artifact.
I love the fact that we do that because I'm a very visual person, as you can tell, a lot of things in my background. But the ability to see something and then maybe start to execute on that is just going to simplify the whole process of designing some patterns that might work, or designing some infrastructure that might work, or designing layers of infrastructure. It could be the network layer or the security and identity layer, something like that. Application Composer, I think, is going to simplify the whole process end to end for application developers.
Yeah, and you mentioned that we're going to see shortly, so that suggests we have a demo. We like demos on this show.
Yeah, it's a demo and it's live.
Aha, even better.
Okay, it looks like
nothing like a live demo.
Yeah. So this, you may be familiar with the AWS Management Console. This is a developer tool that's operating in the browser, accessible through the Management Console. And in its current form, there's no sort of API or sort of account interaction. This is a dev tool. I'll show you sort of in a moment how I can connect this to my local development environment. I can use my IDE, my own CLIs, my own Git workflow. I'm going to bypass that for a moment because I want to just show you kind of what the core engine looks like. So I'll dismiss this and we can come back and kind of talk through that. So given that the birthday is coming up, let's start with an S3 bucket. So I can visually drag and drop an S3 bucket from the left onto the right side here. I can visually interact with some of its properties. So obviously a logical ID for my bucket, and then Composer's exposing certain things that you can tune. It's not trying to give you all the knobs visually that you could express in a framework like CloudFormation, but it's trying to give you a starting point. And if I switch to this template panel here, this is the durable artifact underneath the surface. I'll show you later how you can import your own. I'm just starting from scratch. And when I drag in this S3 bucket, what Composer's doing is giving me a starting point. This is a fully deployment ready snippet. I can go and deploy this and I'll have a bucket. That bucket will have public access turned off by default. So of course you could make changes here to enable public access. And it has
I'm
a
glad you
bucket
mentioned that.
policy.
I was gonna actually ask you, can you actually change this like template snippet?
Yeah, I can change it here, or I could change it over here. I could change it in the visual as well. So in this case, block public access. I can save it on the visual, and Steve, it's on both directions. So I can make changes in the infrastructure as code or the visual. Either direction works. The other aspect that I wanted to highlight for you is that you have these little, what we call these facets, these ports on the side. The idea is, and for many serverless developers, it's one thing to kind of figure out, okay, I know how to express a bucket. I know how to express a Lambda function. The function obviously has way more sort of visual properties I can interface with. But what happens when you want to combine the two together? What do you need to do? There's sort of, you might expect IAM policies, event triggers, those kinds of things for each resource combination can be a lot to hold in your head. There's a lot of sort of docs to go through there. And those are all available for you. Those are all good references. But what we're trying to do with Composer is take a connection and make it really simple to express. So if I want this bucket to interface with the function, I can do this. And then we have a notification at the bottom that's going to highlight for me the change that happened behind the scenes in this template view. We call this change inspector. And in this case, on this direction from the bucket to the function, I've wired up an events mapping. And as we talked about earlier, this change, this is like getting started. You can deploy this, and on object created and object removed, we'll invoke the function. You might go and customize this. Commonly, you want to filter the type of objects that you want to trigger a function on. But that's a starting point that gets you going. That for you, you don't have to go and learn all the things necessary to get your application running. And then let me scroll over here and add another function. And if I connect this function to this bucket on the other side of the relationship, I have two other types of connections we can make. This sharing environment variable. So now I have access in the CloudFormation template, the bucket name and bucket ARN that'll be provisioned when I go on to deploy this template. And in this case, a AWS SAM policy template, which represents the IAM policy necessary to allow that function to read and write to the bucket.
Okay. Yeah, I like this. This is like,
you're
doing a lot, but with minimal code so far, right? If we were doing this from a coding standpoint or even a template, we'd have written an awful lot of stuff by this point.
Yeah, I mean, let's
and
see.
then trying to like test it and debug it and everything too. But like this, it seems like because we're working with two services, Lambda and S3. So with Lambda on one side, creating the connection to S3, that's almost like the the execution policy and permissions that we would need. And then have from S3 to Lambda, basically some kind of event notification, I'm guessing, that says, hey, I have a new object, I have a new picture or video, and I need you to do something with it. That's the invocation permission that S3 is granted to Lambda, I imagine.
That's right. And as you can see, that like getting that down is already 80 lines
Yeah.
of this YAML document. And so the idea here is to really just rapidly speed up how a developer can create their idea based on AWS managed services.
My fingertips, thank you, Ryan. I don't want to type all that.
Yeah, I mean, fingertips, thank you, but also my brain's thanking you, because you can see the connections when you're scrolling through that template file, or even a CDK app. Sometimes it's hard to see that relationship. Especially if it's like multiple pages of code or template. Here, it's like right in front of you.
Yeah, so I'll show you another example that gets to even more complex cases. So I've quickly wired up an API gateway. This house also has a visual interface for sort of designing the routes. And behind the scenes here is both the CloudFormation content and the Open API definition for these methods. And I've put down an SQS queue. Let me move it over a little bit. This is really common for interacting with functions. You can sort of get data out of your queue and process information and kind of build an architecture around a durable queue like SQS, and then easily create a dead letter queue as well. In this case, I might put, and let me just disconnect this for visual, I might put a function between these two. But with direct service integrations, I don't necessarily need to. If I have a pretty simple need, like I want to use an API to put message into a queue, that I will downstream use a custom Lambda function that I write to interpret those messages. So I can draw that connection just like any other. And then you'll see in Change Inspector here, we've wired up the AWS API integration for the whole thing.
Oh, it's very much, it's a diff view. I love it.
Yeah. And this one is a lot, right? So once you learn it and do it, great. You learn how to do it. We're not trying to like remove that loop for you. AWS Application Composer is helping you go faster and just get an idea out there. We're trying to demonstrate and not hide the template code, because you should understand what's going on. You're going to own this artifact and own the sort of operations of this application. But you don't need to write all, what looks like several dozen lines in order to just get this going. That's the point. And then I can go on and create, say, that dead letter queue just by doing this. And then I've got the redrive policy wired up.
I think this is cool because like we can get something started pretty quick from the ground up, just from nothing to getting something functional. What if I already have, let's say, like a CloudFormation template? Can I import that?
Yeah. Let me show that to you. And to do that, I'm going to kind of zoom out on my screen share. Give me just a moment to do that.
Yeah. While you do that, I'm actually going to bring up, because we actually had that question in the chat, right? Can current code file be used in here? So yeah, obviously this is for existing developers who already have applications and assets. They're kind of thinking like, how can I use this?
Yeah, so give me just a moment to get that screen share back up, but I'm ready to show that to you.
And while you're doing that, I have so many thoughts around this, and I'm so excited to like jump in. It just went generally available a couple of days ago, so I haven't had a chance to really dive in and build like complex architecture. But as a technical trainer, I can only imagine how this is going to simplify the demos that I perform during classes that I teach.
Yeah, there's as I mentioned earlier, there is a news blog post on it, so I've just put into the chat. So from my colleague Chani, I'm gonna read that.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm ready to show that to you. I just got to get the screen share back up. Looks like we're ready. So I showed you earlier, there's this modal that I went past. So I'm going to go back to that. When you come into the project, you can, what we use or call, I should say, connected mode. This lets you connect this browser-based tool directly to your file system. You'll see on the right a very squished down IDE. This happens to be Visual Studio Code. It doesn't need to be. Any of your local tooling that's compatible with what we currently support, AWS CloudFormation and SAM, will work just fine. So on the right side here, I've already checked out a public sample. This is an AWS serverless shopping cart that you can find on AWS samples and on serverless land. What I'm going to do is use this UI to point at where I've checked this out. Just git checkout on disk. I'm just going to select that. And you may notice sort of up here in a tiny little window, I'm granting the browser permission to access this file system. This is a session-based permissions. It's based on a standard browser API. So we've just leveraged that to create this connection. And once I do that, you should see the template get loaded in. And I think I need to select the right file instead of just talking around.
And while you're doing that, there's something that's standing out to me. So we have our developers who know how to write code. Steve called it out, mentally writing the code and fingertips actually physically writing out the code. But if they already have something that is well architected, if they already have something that already works, and they want to take advantage of the speed and rapidness that Application Composer can work for them, using something like a GUI really does help a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've pointed at the right file just so you can follow along. This shopping cart service is what I've got opened up here. You can kind of see this referenced in the top panel here. I'm going to collapse. Actually, I'm going to show you one thing before I collapse this so you can see what's going on. Now this is linked. And if I say drag on a new function, you'll see that this source directory populates a handler. This is not wiring up the code for you. It's just giving you a sort of basic handler. Again, the idea is you can always deploy this application. You're going to want to go and customize it. In this case, go in and add in any logic. I'm going to collapse the Explorer once I reselect the template. And the idea here is that I could make changes. Say I wanted to, find this function in here. It looks like I've got a global setup here for memory sizes. I've got all these functions in the template. If I add in, say, an S3 bucket, I'll notice the git def showing me I've got a bucket down here. Here's the function I found earlier. If I've got this template open and I've got memory set to 3008, just to kind of demonstrate the point, I'm going to change that to 1024 and I'm going to save the file. What's going to happen is that change gets sort of detected on this side. You can see external file changes auto-loaded here in a small pop-up. I open this back up and I've got the memory change. So this is connected. I can start running a CLI as I make changes, like the SAM CLI, which can automatically pick up changes as you make, say edits like this. So now I have a function and a bucket connected, as you saw me do in the earlier demo. And I didn't even walk you through this. We've got obviously more services going on. This is just an off-the-shelf sample that's never been brought into Composer before, and I can just start iterating. And that's the idea. Bring in your application, start iterating. You can go on to manipulate the code definition in IAC, and all the changes will just be reflected here in the visual tool. So it's offering you choice. You're not sort of locked into a one-way visual builder.
Yeah, that's the bit I love the most. I think when I first heard about it, my initial inclination was, okay, it's going to be people who are just getting started with serverless. They're going to live in the design, and that's where they're just going to spend all their time. But the fact that you can actually take an existing serverless app and bring it in here and still work with it, and it's a live update, two-way live update, that's just fantastic.
That's what I was thinking. It's a live update. It's like he's making changes on the screen. It's updating the file. It's making changes in the file. It's updating on the screen. My gosh.
Yeah. And for instance, I noticed there's an authorizer in this API that's not wired up. Now I can just quickly connect a user pull client to a function. And yeah, now I can start iterating on this function in my local file system, taking advantage of a Cognito user pull. And I didn't have to spend any time figuring out, how do I get a basic authorizer wired up? How do I get a basic Cognito pull stood up? Again, you're gonna customize it. You're gonna start learning what your application needs are, but the prototyping's done for you.
So, or even what's wrong, because I can imagine sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, yeah, just how many lines do you actually have in that template file in the right now?
Oh boy, looks like we're nearing 500.
Nearly 500. Cool.
I can only imagine, like, when you get into 5,000 lines of code, how complex that code base might be. You can drop it in Application Composer, iterate over it, and also identify areas for improvement or a missing connection.
Yeah. And I neglected one feature. I'm sorry, Steve. As you go through and get a much bigger template, we have this grouping functionality that can help you just start decluttering the visual and start saying, like, okay, this, I'm making arbitrary grouping right now, but you might say, okay, this entire piece of the architecture is my billing or my checkout and inventory service in the cart context. And that's how you start to scale this visual, as I was talking about earlier, where you might have a 5,000 line application definition, but visualized in a much more coherent way.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I'm like, again, I've gone back to VS Code, being ex-code developer. Right? I'm looking at that map on the right-hand side, right? Which, okay, it's giving me the structure of the file, but I'm not really comprehending the resources that are going into this application. But when I go to the Composer, I can see it, all the grouping, etc., all the connections. It's just so much more apparent what's going on. And it's almost like, and I guess in a sense it is, I remember back in the day, we had architecture diagrams. I don't know if anybody does that anymore, but back when I was a developer, we had architectural diagrams, right? But the fact that this is like a live architectural diagram that's updating as I go makes it so much more valuable, right? I remember when those architectural diagrams were written, within 6 months, we'd written a bunch of code and they were out of date, right? If they're even in date to start with, right? Whereas this is keeping everything in sync for me. And I have this instant grok of like, oh yeah, that's how things are connected without having to churn through all that template or all that code.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm seeing all the comments, like people saying, yeah, this is amazing. All the comments of, I'm a very visual person. This is going to be great for my workflow, or even like being able to deploy it. And I saw one comment where someone said, I want to start using this today.
And not the only one.
I know.
I am definitely checking this out this afternoon.
Yeah, and thankfully you can. It is generally available. It's a free browser-based tool. You just need to log into your AWS account and get started.
Oh, this is cool. This is cool. So before we leave you, or Ryan, you leave us, is there anything else you want to point out in the demo, or places where people can go to get started? Obviously, people are eager champing at the bit to go with this.
Yeah, well, I'll do both. So one thing I wanted to point out in the demo, you see this sort of read-only resource support. There's a limited selection of what you can drag on and immediately have built for you. But anything that you can express in AWS CloudFormation, which is any resource type you can build with AWS, will visualize that, help you group it into your architecture. For instance, you could start saying that belongs in this group and stuff it over there. We'll visualize the resources in it. That support's only going to get richer over time and give you more things you can build with. So this is GA of this platform that gives you this sort of back and forth, to misuse the term as we just heard from our friends. But this is just a starting point. You're going to see more resource support over time. But today you'll be able to fully visualize anything that you write here on the right side in your editor. You'll see visualized on the left. And as I said at the top, there's an infrastructure as code challenge that people face starting with serverless. Composer is really going to help you with that. There's also the event-driven architecture piece. Mm-hmm. We're helping you wire up event-driven architectures, but learning those is still tough. I'd recommend serverlessland.com as a great resource. I should have referenced this earlier. I pulled this sample right off the site and loaded that into Composer.
Oh, so this is the one that you're working with in VS Code. Okay.
Yeah, this is exactly it. This is just an off-the-shelf sample from the site. Anything you find here that's in the AWS SAM or CloudFormation framework will just work. And there's a lot of learning material here too to get you started on EDA if that's a new domain for you.
So anybody who's really watching that doesn't have an existing serverless app but wants to work or experiment with how Composer's working with the live updates in an existing app, go check this out and get started this afternoon.
A question for Ryan. Do you mind if because Jeff Barr just went through the what's new on AWS, his recap. Do you mind if we bring him back in?
It's already here.
Jeff, welcome back. So Jeff, what are your thoughts about Application Composer?
That looks really cool. And I'm also very visual, and almost everything I do, there's a visual component to it. Like when I'm trying to make sense of the world, of like people throw me a lot of random stuff and I'm thinking, well, what are all the pieces and how do they fit together and how do they relate? And I invariably draw some kind of a diagram. Like when I'm getting ready to write a blog post, some people do an outline. If an outline works for you, that's awesome. I like to use a mind map, and a mind map's somewhat similar structurally to an outline, but it fits everything on one page, and it also like looks a lot cooler than an outline. But just in general, when I'm trying to get something figured out, just getting visual as quickly as possible just seems to be not that I have any artistic skill whatsoever, but drawing things and organizing them with boxes and lines seems to be fundamental. So pretty excited about this.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, being able to see the strings connect. It's like being a kid and tying strings from one chair to another chair and actually like wiring it together and seeing how it all works. I feel like a kid again, Ryan. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really been helpful for the customers who've gotten started so far. I'm really excited to see what people build with it.
I'm seeing some questions in the chat. One says, sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have a question here. So how do I connect this to VS Code? Because I think you kind of jumped straight in. It was already connected. Is that a simple process?
Yeah, let me just walk through that again one more time. That's a great question. So when you either load or start a project, you have this option to connect, this file system connection. So if I reload this project, I hit the select folder. Now I'm interacting with my local file system. I happen to be on a Mac. It's going to work fine on Windows and Linux as well. It only is this particular UI is only supported for browsers that support this API, which are currently Chrome-based browsers. But if you're on Firefox, if you're on Safari, you can still exchange content back and forth like any other sort of browser can. So if you're experiencing this on Chrome, for example, and you click in and you can select, this is just finding the templates that are in that folder that you've given it. Once you hit create here, you're connected. And any changes back and forth between your IDE, and it doesn't have to be a specific IDE, anything that you can work with AWS CloudFormation files with, that's going to work great. And you can see those changes. For instance, I showed earlier a new function that I drag on gets scaffolded in this direction. There's the new one, function 2, that gets added in. And I can make any changes on the right and see those reflected on the left. So that's how you do it. You just sort of set that up with this connected mode when you get started in the product.
Nice. Very easy.
That's really nice. And that in earlier days, criticism of visual tools was often that they were effectively one way. You could draw something amazing, and it would then give you all of the textual representation. But then you're like, okay, well, I modified the text. Can I go the other way around? Like there's some fancy word for that, but I don't remember what it is. But like bidirectional.
Bidirectional?
Yeah, bidirectionality is how we refer to it.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah,
the next question says. Important. Sorry, Jeff. The next question says, can we use Fargate for ECS or EKS in Application Composer? And I imagine the answer is probably going to be yes, because if we can take a CloudFormation template and import that, or existing architecture or SAM CLI and import that, it can work with any other services.
That's right. So if you have that already expressed, or you find a pattern that you're interested in on serverless land, you're going to be able to drag that in, and it's going to show up as one of these resources. It'll even visualize, as you see here, some of the connections that are already present in that code or the ones you create. Over time, you're going to see us expand the resources available here. So for instance, if I search for Fargate today, it's not yet available. You can click this link and give us direct feedback and tell us, hey, I want to be able to build Fargate. I have challenges connecting my Fargate task to Cloud Map or whatever it is. That helps us understand where are you challenging in getting configuration and integration set up. We're going to help you with that. But today you can absolutely import it and visualize it.
Nice. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time with you, Ryan. Before where we leave us, anything you want to leave the audience with?
No, I think that's it. I just start playing around, have fun, let us know what you think. And and I hope this helps you get going with EDA. And for those that just joined, I wanted to reference serverlessland.com once more as a good learning site for both samples and learning material, tutorials, that kind of stuff that you can bring right into the app in the management console.
And we just had one question very, very quickly before we depart there. It was a question about the YAML file with automation. You just work with the YAML file in the background, just keep reusing it, but use Composer in the front.
Yeah, Composer is really precise in how it parses and edits this document. So if you come in and make a change to, say, memory size in your function, you're impacting the specific setting in the template. So this is not going to overwrite any of your projects. It's working with your YAML document. It's trying to be a power tool for you. So yeah, you can bring in any of these templates. It can even support JSON format, though of course it'll by default work in YAML. So yeah.
Awesome.
So I can keep these files under source code control and get diffs and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think over time, you're going to see us create connections to other AWS services that you might be using to create that Git-based workflow. Today, it's only that local connection to your file system. So for example, in VS Code, I happen to pair my workflow with the SAM CLI. That SAM CLI can interpret this YAML document. It can build and package my functions. It can deploy that via CloudFormation. And it even has a feature called Accelerate, which will rapidly iterate over the code and the infrastructure as code and update my APIs as I go. So you can pair it with anything you like. I happen to use SAM CLI. Any CLI that you wire up while you're in this connected mode will just work.
Well, I got to be honest, you've completely blown my schedule for the afternoon now, because after the show's finished, I'm going to check this out. So, Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. That was pretty awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ryan.